on bias, what it looks like and its effects within the 6 areas of the Civil Rights Team project. Those are race and ethnicity, disabilities, religion, gender identity and expression, national origin and ancestry, and sexual orientation. Bias exists in all communities, and Sanford High School is no exception. Our Civil Rights Team has been resurrected this year because we have had incidences of bias that have negatively impacted our community. Our team believes that it is important for all students and staff to have common language around these 6 areas of bias. Our goals include helping the school community stand up to bias in our school, to engage our school community in having difficult conversations, to improve the climate and culture, to support career education and positive workplace interactions, and to promote a civil exchange of ideas in our school. On behalf of Sanford High School and the SHS Civil Rights Team, we would like to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Baldwin, the director. Mr. Baldwin is the director of the Maine Civil Rights Team project out of the State Attorney General's office. Mr. Baldwin grew up in Central Maine and taught 8th grade reading for 9 years. Brave man. He works with over 175 schools all across the state, from elementary to middle to high school. So ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Baldwin. And just a quick note before he starts, we will dismiss you when he's done. Stay put.
Good morning, Sanford High School, and welcome to Understanding Bias. I want to start by pointing out a couple of things that I think are important in terms of the title of my presentation today. The first is understanding bias. Bias is a complex concept, but once you understand what it is, it's hard not to see it everywhere around you. So part of the reason why we want to try to understand it is so we can recognize it as a problem and an issue. But we don't just want to recognize it as a problem and an issue that exists in the world or somewhere else. That at Sanford High School is extremely important in terms of the work that we're going to be doing here today and then moving forward for your entire school community. Because we're not just at Sanford High School today, we want you to see that bias is something that exists here in your school community. So let's get started. I like to start with the single greatest teaching tool that I know of, and incredibly, it's a kid's story. And so I hope as high school students, you're not sitting there and thinking to yourself, seriously, buddy, you're going to share a Dr. Seuss story with us? Because I seriously am. This is the single greatest teaching tool that I know of for getting people to understand this concept of bias. And I use this with students of all ages. That includes elementary students, middle-level students, high school students, but also college-level students who are training to become teachers, and including experienced educators, including at an in-service training that I did earlier this week. So I use this for the simple reason that it works. Now, I'm not actually going to be reading to you the Dr. Seuss story, The Sneetches. Instead, I'm going to be sharing with you the 1970s animated sing-along version of this story. It is glorious and it is spectacular, and I hope that you can find it in your mature souls to enjoy parts of it. And here's the important thing. I'm going to stop it at the exact moment that it becomes interesting, at the hook moment, and I want us to think about this issue because we're going to dissect this a little bit. Look for specific ways that the star-bellied Sneetches mistreat the plain-bellied Sneetches. And a little bit of background in case you're unfamiliar with the story. In the story of the Sneetches, there are basically 2 types of Sneetch. The first is pictured here. They have a star on their bellies, and so they're called the star-bellied Sneetches. The other type of Sneetch is remarkably similar, except for one difference. They don't have a star on their bellies, and they call themselves the plain-bellied Sneetches. The thing that we need to know and understand is that if you have that star in Sneetch society, you're probably living a pretty good life. With that star comes all of the power and all of the privilege. And unfortunately, much of their power and privilege derives from the fact that they treat the plain-bellied Sneetches horribly. So then, we're going to watch the opening 5 minutes of the story of the Sneetches, and then we're going to dissect it a bit. It's on YouTube. You can see it later.
Oh, at the edge of each ocean, Speaking of speeches. Speak, did you say speeches? S-S-S-M-W-T-C-H-E-S, speeches. O-S-M-W-T-C-H-E-S, speeches.
Now the star-bellied speeches had bellies with stars. The plain-bellied speeches had none upon Mars. No stars on their bellies. No stars upon Mars. Now those stars weren't so big. They were really quite small. You would think such a thing wouldn't matter at all. But because they had stars, all the star-bellied speeches would brag.
We're the best kind of speech on the speeches.
With their snoots in the air, they would sniff and they'd snort. Well, it had nothing to do with a plain-belly sort.
Ronald, remember, when you are up walking, you walk past the speech of that type without talking. Keep your snoot in the air and remember to snort. We have no time whatever with the plain-bellied sort.
When the star-bellied children went out to play ball, could a plain-belly get them again? Not at all. You only could play if your bellies had stars, and the plain-bellied children had none upon Mars.
Yeah, your belly's got no stars. Twinkle, twinkle, lovely little star.
Twinkle, twinkle, stupid little star.
If there's one upon your tummy that's just yummy, oh my chummy.
There isn't, you're a crummy, slummy, gummy, bummy, dummy.
Likewise, likewise, spaghetti and your mommy. Twinkle, twinkle, lovely little star.
Twinkle, twinkle, stupid little star.
When the star-bellied speeches had frankfurters, or picnics, or parties, or marshmallow toasts, they never invited the plain-bellied speeches. They left them off cold in the dark at the beaches.
From the heights of Nuba to the gullies of Izu, there is nobody else who has won. We're the favorite few. And so we're toast, Christmas roasting, a toast, Christmas roasting, and toast the glorious divinity that makes us what we are. Sound off and let the welcome ring in praise of our exclusive King. A toast, Christmas roasting, a toast, Christmas roasting, a toast to Mary Star.
They kept them away, never let them come near. That's how they treated them, year after year. They got snubbed, they got snooted, their arms got booted, while the star-bellied speeches all taunted and hooted.
They just are not suited. No stars on Mars.
Then one day, it seems, while the plain-bellied speeches were moping and doping along on the beaches, just sitting there, wishing their bellies had stars, a stranger approached in the strangest of cars.
So, obviously, there's a lot of stuff that's going on, specific ways that the star-bellied sneetches are mistreating the plain-bellied sneetches. We've got, I would love it if there was less light right now. There's taunting, there's name-calling, there's exclusion, and there's violence. Now, knowing all that, we now want to go next level here. We want to analyze this so that we can truly understand this thing called bias. So, 4 important things from the story of the sneetches. Starting with thing number 1. The reason for these behaviors is bias. Which behaviors? All the behaviors, like the entirety of the story that we've already seen. And given that bias explains everything that we see happening in the story of the sneetches, and it's part of the name of my presentation today, let's get into this. Let's get an actual definition. And unlike most complex ideas, bias actually has a useful dictionary definition. So this comes to us from the Oxford English. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. That's a mouthful, so let's dissect it a little bit more. If you really wanted to simplify this, you could hack off every single word that appears after prejudice. Bias equals prejudice. And that gives us a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the story of the Sneetches. But let's go further, because the further in we go, the more applicable it becomes. Bias is prejudice in favor of or against. We see both forms. We see bias in favor of those who have the star and against those who do not. One thing, person, or group. Of course we see this bias, this prejudice directed at individual Sneetches, but more importantly, we see it directed at an entire group of Sneetches based on a shared characteristic or trait, their plain bellies. Compared with another, we see constant comparisons between the two groups, and usually in a way considered to be unfair. Well, we can clearly see that everything that's happening in the story of the Sneetches is completely unfair. So bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. And bias helps us understand everything that we see happening in the story of the Sneetches. Thing number two, the bias is both individual and part of the culture. It's obviously affecting individuals and their behavior, but the thing that we also need to understand is the fact that they all learned it somewhere. So these young Sneetches who are taunting others for not having stars on their belly, they didn't wake up one morning and suddenly decide to do that. It's learned behavior. They learned it from the culture. And this highlights the idea that every single one of them are two things in relation to culture. They're consumers of culture, so the culture influences what they're going to do, and then they're creators of culture because they act on the lessons that they've learned, and then their behaviors, their actions, contribute to that culture, which is reinforced, and it then creates more power to go and influence more individual Sneetches. This is a difficult cycle to break because individuals act on the lessons they've learned and contribute to the lessons for other individuals to learn. So the bias is both individual and part of the culture. They all learned it somewhere. Difficult cycle to break. Thing number three, the bias component of these behaviors makes them especially damaging. Now, obviously, if you're a Sneetch or anything else, you don't want to be taunted. You don't want to be called names. You don't want to be left out of everything that appears to be fun. You certainly don't want to be kicked. But the thing that makes it especially damaging is that it seems as though there's a reason behind the behaviors. Because it's not just random individuals acting out on ideas they woke up with that morning. Every individual behavior has the weight of the entire culture behind it. So when a plain-bellied Sneetch is called a name, it's more than just the name. It's knowing that that was learned from the entire weight of that culture. It's never the individual action. It's the weight that it takes from everything else. And the best evidence that we have of this damage comes at the point where I stop the film. And that is the plain-bellied Sneetches moping and doping alone on the beaches, just sitting there wishing their bellies had stars. The cumulative effect of all this bias on the plain-bellied Sneetches is they ultimately become ashamed of who they are and would do anything to change that. So the bias component of these behaviors makes them especially damaging. Thing number four, if you truly want to change things, so let's say you're tasked with going into the world of the Sneetches and changing this culture, this mess, you'd better go in there and talk about stars. I can guarantee you that if you go into Sneetch society and you're like, hey, let's talk about stars, there are going to be a lot of Sneetches who are uncomfortable with that idea. There are going to be some Sneetches who yell you out of town and don't want to listen to a thing that you have to say. You're not necessarily going to be popular. But if you ever want to change anything, it's common sense. You're going to have to go in there and talk about stars, even when it makes Sneetches uncomfortable. Especially when it makes Sneetches uncomfortable. You got to talk about what the issue is, and clearly it's the bias. Clearly this is about stars. So if you truly want to change things, you're going to have to talk stars. That's everything that I want to take from the Sneetches. And of course, you figured out that Dr. Seuss wasn't writing about made-up creatures. He was very much writing about us. And so it's tempting to think that the stars must represent a specific thing. I think that's too limiting. So instead, I would argue that the stars represent differences. And if we view it with that expansive idea of what they are, then it starts to make sense in a variety of different contexts, because humans are different from each other in many ways, of course. Now, I have an ask moving forward. Up to this point, it's been about made-up creatures in a made-up world, singing songs about their differences. Moving forward, we're talking about us. We're talking about the real world. We're talking about differences that exist amongst human populations. So my ask moving forward, you've been good so far, but please take this seriously. It's easy not to take the Sneetches seriously. You're kind of encouraged not to. But moving forward, we're talking about us, and we're talking about people who are sitting here in this room. We're talking about all of us. We're talking about the differences that exist amongst people here. And your classmates demand your respect. So please, be super respectful moving forward. Because now we're going to look at bias in our schools. And I work in schools all around the state, and I hear a lot of stories. And in my travels, I hear about students who are teased or targeted, or perhaps even worse. And it's for all kinds of reasons. It's for being Black, Asian, or Native American. It's for being immigrants or having ancestry in Central South America or the Middle East. It's for being Jewish, Muslim, or Mormon. It's for being deaf or blind or using a wheelchair. It's for having autism, Down syndrome, or a learning disability. It's for being male or female. It's for being transgender or gender nonconforming or non-binary. It's for being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the things that I tend to hear about the most. And so specifically, I hear about students who are teased or targeted based on their race, their national origin and ancestry, their religion, their disabilities, including physical and cognitive, intellectual, and behavioral disabilities, for their gender, including gender identity and expression, and for their sexual orientation. If I had to summarize it all here, again, the stars represent differences, and people are teased or targeted based on the fact that they are perceived as being different from their peers. And these are known as civil rights issues. Now, I know about what I hear about in the rest of the state, but I'm no expert about Sanford High School and your school community. You, on the other hand, are the experts on this school community. So to make this relevant, to make sure that we're thinking about how bias might affect life here at Sanford High School, we're now going to open it up to a participatory activity where we look and think about the issues that may exist here in your school community. So I'm going to read to you a series of prompts. There are going to be 5 of them. They're all going to start the same. Get up if you have ever witnessed or are aware of teasing or taunting in your school related to, and then I'm going to put pieces and parts of people's identities up there. And if you're aware of that sort of thing happening here in your school community, you're going to get up. If you're not aware of that sort of thing happening in your school community, don't get up. I have a few specific asks for this activity, though. 1, please don't decide right now that I'm not doing this. I'm not getting up for any of these. You're not too cool for this activity. I know you might think you are, but seriously, you really are not too cool for this activity. I promise you that. That's my first ask. My second ask actually connects with the one that I just made where we transitioned from the Sneetches to the real world. And that is this. Let us do this activity in silence. Let us do this activity in silence. Here's why. Because for every single one of these things that I put up, as soon as one person gets up, that means this is an issue that exists here in your school community. And I can guarantee that if this is an issue that is here in your school community, then there are individuals sitting here in this auditorium whose lives have been affected by this. Maybe once, but maybe it's even part of their daily existence. And they already deal with enough. We're not going to be disrespectful for those people and their experiences here today during a time that we're specifically engaged in looking at these issues. So please, 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 for just a few minutes, just do this activity in total silence. The only sound should be you physically getting up if that's what you're doing. We don't need to talk about it, and we certainly don't need laughter. Please and thank you in advance. Here we go with our first one. Get up if you have ever witnessed or are aware of teasing or taunting in your school related to race or ancestry. This wasn't part of the original instructions, but please have a look around the auditorium. And if you're up, you may sit back down. And I want to thank you right now for being respectful. Let's do it just like that for the next 4. Get up if you have ever witnessed or are aware of teasing or taunting in your school related to religion. And have a look around, please. And if you're up, you may sit back down. Get up if you have ever witnessed or are aware of teasing or taunting in your school related to disabilities. And please have a look around. And if you're up, you can get back down. Get up if you have ever witnessed or are aware of teasing or taunting in your school related to gender. Have a look around. And if you're up, you can get back down. Get up if you have ever witnessed or are aware of teasing or taunting in your school related to sexual orientation. And please have a look around. And if you're up, you can get back down. Thank you for taking my instructions seriously and doing that activity in silence. That's the level of respect that we really need to bring to these conversations. So thank you for that. A couple observations. One observation is probably the same as one that all of you made, and that is for every single one of these prompts, there is a significant number of us getting up, probably a majority. And for some of them, it wasn't just a majority, it was an overwhelming majority. So clearly, when we're talking about issues of bias, we're not just talking about things that happen somewhere else. It's important that we ground these discussions and understand that we're talking about things that happen here. We're talking about your school community, Sanford High School. We're talking about us. And sometimes that might make people a little uncomfortable, especially as we move into the more challenging part of my presentation. But we're absolutely talking about us. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Bias in our schools, it exists, including here. Now, I want to share with you some information about how exactly bias works, because I think people have some misperceptions about how this actually works. So I want to start with an extreme example. And I'm equipped to do this because in the Office of the Attorney General, the State Attorney General is responsible for enforcing something called the Maine Civil Rights Act. And the Maine Civil Rights Act is basically Maine's anti-hate crimes law. And a hate crime is basically exactly what it sounds like. A crime has been committed, and there's an element of hate, an element of bias or prejudice, specifically targeting someone based on who they are. And I'm going to share with you one example of a hate crime from our office, because rather than get into all the details of the law, I think we learn more about it just by understanding an example. So this is an official court document, and I'm just going to read to you from a section of this court document, which are the facts of this case. Here they are. The victim is a 40-year-old man from Somalia. He works as an independent taxi cab driver based in Portland, Maine. On or about the evening of October 12, 2014, the victim was driving his taxi and picked up the defendant and a female companion in the Old Port area of Portland. The defendant requested that the victim drive them to a residential address in Westbrook. After the victim disclosed to the defendant that he was from Somalia, the defendant responded that he did not like Somalis or other blacks. The defendant said that he had a gun and would kill the victim upon arrival at the defendant's residence. The defendant then demanded that the victim stop the cab at the 7-Eleven store located at the intersection of Forest Avenue and Riverside Street in Portland. The defendant left the cab and slammed his fist on the windshield, causing it to crack nearly the entire width. The defendant then threw the fare at the victim and ran off with his female companion towards Westbrook. The taxi cab driver exited his car and followed the defendant and his female companion along East Bridge Street in Westbrook and saw the defendant and his companion enter a residence. The victim abandoned his pursuit, turned around, and was walking back to his cab when the defendant came running at him with a gun, equipped with a red laser sight. The victim was running away when he heard a gunshot. The responding officers interviewed the defendant, who admitted to breaking the windshield of the cab and asserted that if a Somali came to my house, I would shoot him. He also said that he effing hated Somalians. He denied possessing a firearm, but stated that he wished he had one because he probably would have shot someone. The The officers retrieved from the defendant's residence a plastic gun case with a silver-colored ammunition magazine clip containing ammunition in 9mm caliber and a single 9mm hollow point bullet. The officers then recovered a 9mm shell casing in the area where the defendant shot at the victim, and that shell casing matched the single hollow point bullet found in the defendant's plastic gun case. The defendant's conduct placed the victim in fear for his safety. So that's an example of a hate crime. And I want to use that word hate in a different way, because there's so much that I hate about what I just described to you, the facts of that case. The first thing that I hate is that I'm a lifelong Mainer, and I like to think that Maine is better than that. I like to think that this is a welcoming state. But it's hard to make that argument when you learn that something like that happened here, in my state, in our state, the place that we call home. That makes me angry to think that that happened here. I also hate the fact that there's now a man driving a taxi cab in Portland, Maine, where every single time he picks up a white passenger, he's probably asking himself, could this happen to me again? And even if it doesn't happen to me again, is this how they all feel about my presence here in this state? I hate that this man has children who attend Portland public schools, and they'll probably never look at their white classmates in the same way. They're probably wondering, that kid over there, could that be the son of the man who did this to my father? Even if it's not, is this how all my classmates feel about me and my community? Speaking of that community, I hate that there's an entire population in the city of Portland and in the state who learned of this happening and identified with this man's experience. I hate the fact that when I share this experience around the state, this is probably happening right here with a few of you, people think to themselves, that was Portland. That couldn't happen here. Why is he sharing a story that happened in Portland? I hate that I know the fact that that could happen here, and that the man who did this could be a graduate of Sanford High School or any school system across this entire state. The final thing that I hate about sharing this example of a hate crime is that while it may seem shocking, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that an individual might do something like this. When you think back to the speeches and the idea that bias is not just individual behavior, it's cultural. And this man learned this behavior somewhere. He didn't wake up one morning and come up with this stuff on his own. He was taught to hate people who are somehow different from himself. He absorbed messages about people of color, about immigrants, perhaps about Muslims, and he took it to the extreme. But he is a product of his culture. Let's make this a little more real, because that feels so foreign to many of us. But this probably doesn't. This is you and your best friend. And when I say best friend, I mean best friend. You've always been best friends for as long as you can remember. You're going to be best friends forever. And you share everything with each other. You got a story? This is the person you want to tell it to. You got your own in-jokes, you kind of got your own language, and part of your friendship is you are horrible with each other because you can get away with it. You can be a monster to your best friend, and in fact, it seems kind of funny. It's part of what you do. So, you and your best friend, you insult each other a lot because it's funny. And so, perhaps you can easily imagine a situation where you and your best friend are there, you're in each other's way. You simply say to your best friend, out of my way, retard. You know your friend will forgive you, and in fact, your friend will probably say something equally insulting back to you, perhaps worse. This is part of the language. This is what you do. Some of you are identifying with this. Surely you know people who talk this way, and you're probably thinking to yourself, that is just not a big deal at all. Now, I want to point out a few more important things here. This is you and your best friend. We already know that. But I also want to highlight something about you. You're a good person. You are a good person. Congratulations on that. Nicely done. You're a good person, and part of being a good person for you is that You would never use that word retard to describe someone with an actual disability. You would never do that. You'd totally use it to describe your best friend, but you would never use it to describe someone with an actual disability. Never. And also, you believe that people with and without disabilities are equal and equally entitled to respect and dignity. So you might be now looking at this and thinking, yeah, exactly. So what's the big deal? Well, I'm going to show you what's the big deal. This is you and your best friend, but oftentimes communication involves other people. Sometimes we get a reminder of this, maybe when there's an adult in the room who calls us out on our behavior, and then we say we're sorry and we don't mean it and we move on with our lives. But now I want to expand the classroom. I want to expand the classroom to everyone who overheard this interaction, and I want to talk about individuals in this room, their unique identities and experiences, and their response to your casual use of that word, retard, to describe your best friend. Now, if I put names up here that happen to be yours, I swear that's a coincidence, so there you have it. That sometimes happens. I want to start with Andrew. Andrew's autistic. He has autism. He receives special education services here at school. And Andrew completely hates every second of being here at school. It has nothing to do with his teachers. It has nothing to do with his classes. He even sort of gets into the homework. The thing that makes Andrew's life miserable at school are his experiences with his peers. Andrew struggles with social interactions, and his peers picked up on that at an early age. And so they make fun of him all the time. They make fun of the way he acts around other people. They make fun of the fact that he doesn't have any friends. They make fun of the fact that he's really kind of awkward. But more than anything, they call him retard. He's been called retard pretty much every day of his school experience since middle school. And he's so tired of hearing that word. Every time Andrew hears that word retard, it's a reminder to him that he'll never fit in this school community. And he wants to be anywhere other than here. When Andrew hears that word retard, he wants to turn invisible and just be anywhere but here. That's Andrew. This is Miriam. Miriam has a younger brother with Down syndrome. He goes to the junior high right now. Next year, he's going to be coming on up to the high school. Now, she's smart. She pays attention. She sees the way her classmates treat Andrew, and she worries about what life is going to be like for her younger brother, who has a much more obvious disability than Andrew. He has Down syndrome. So he's going to come up here next year, and she'll be here next year, and she'll look out for him. She can be his protector and make sure that his experiences are okay. That's quite a burden to bear, but it's one that she's willing to do because she loves her younger brother more than anyone on this planet. But she's going to graduate soon. And as soon as she graduates, her younger brother is going to be here all by himself with no one to look out for him. And that scares her. It scares her because she loves her younger brother. She wants him to do well in school. But it also scares her because she knows that the use of that word is representative of a culture that may not treat her younger brother as an equal and with the dignity and respect that he deserves. That's Miriam. This is Cassie. Cassie is an honor roll student. She does really, really, really well. And everyone thinks that Cassie is super, super smart. Cassie is super, super smart, but that doesn't tell the whole story. She acts like school comes really, really easy for her. She does well on something and she laughs it off. Just makes it seem like it comes naturally to her. What she doesn't want people to know is that behind the scenes, Cassie works incredibly, incredibly hard to do well in school. She has a learning disability, but she doesn't want anyone to ever find out about that. That's why she acts like school comes easy to her. So she's sort of ashamed of this disability, and she really could use extra help on most of the work that she does, especially last night's math homework. But she doesn't want to get up in front of a whole class and then have everyone find out that maybe she actually struggles. She doesn't want to be known as a retard or anything. So Cassie instead just suffers in silence and decides to do the work quietly, continuing to work that much harder to do well and never getting the help that she actually needs. That's Cassie. And finally, we got Dylan. Everybody knows a Dylan. Dylan is desperate to be the funny guy. Always wanted to be the class clown. The issue is, Dylan's not that clever. He can't come up with his own jokes. He doesn't have a quick wit. He's not that sharp. So what does Dylan do? What every desperate humorist does. He obsessively watches YouTube videos and Comedy Central, picks up little nuggets, and then parrots them and repeats them so that people will laugh at his imitations and the things that he said. Makes it seem like Dylan's really clever when he's really just a glorified parrot. Now, unfortunately, Dylan has no sense of context, so he'll take things and repeat them, sometimes appropriately, often inappropriately. He does it indiscriminately with his friends, with people who are sort of neutral about him, and with people who really just wish that Dylan would go away. One of the people that Dylan uses his material on a lot is his classmate Steven, the guy who's tired of being called retard his whole life. Well, Dylan picked up that word retard from watching YouTube videos and, you know, observing his peers call each other retard. So he's learned that this is a word you can use to insult people. And he doesn't just use it to insult his friends, he uses it to actually insult people with disabilities like Steven. Dylan learned this word retard somewhere. And let's make it real. Ozzie and Dan Niblock. Ozzie's on the left, Dan is on the right. Ozzie is Dan's son, Dan is Ozzie's dad. Ozzie has Down syndrome. A few years ago, Dan Niblock came to a little bit of civil rights fame when he wrote an impassioned blog post. The impassioned blog post was in response to a well-known political commentator using the word retard and retarded to describe people who might vote for a certain political candidate. Now, I just did verbal gymnastics to avoid telling you who the political commentator was or who the political candidate is, because this work is nonpartisan and it really doesn't matter. Instead, what matters was her use of this word and Dan Niblock's response. Here's what he said. She could have insulted people with other words, but she didn't. She settled on retarded. And she felt comfortable doing so, and that's a problem. I know she makes a living in the shock and awe arena, and I know she's famously abrasive and callous and mean, but I'm still mad. I'm mad that my son and others like him are collateral damage whenever someone feels like firing off an insult. For her fans, she just reinforced the notion that retard is a go-to insult. Thanks. I'll remember that on some random Tuesday in my future when I come home from work and Ozzie is sobbing because some snot-nosed kid called him a retard on the playground. I ask anyone who reads this to stop calling your coffee mug retarded when you can't get the lid to snap on tight. Stop saying it and stop allowing it to be said around you. It's a slur that demeans a lot of people who have a hard enough time getting on with the business of life without having to deal with the constant reminder that a great swath of society thinks their existence is the world's best punchline. I love that Dan Niblock piece because he understands something that might make a lot of us uncomfortable. A lot of us are uncomfortable with accepting our responsibility of contributing to a culture. We think we're immune from culture. Culture doesn't influence us. We're individuals. Oh, that affects other people, but not me. We think that, and we also think that we don't contribute to that culture because we are somehow independent of it and immune from it. Wrong. We're all a part of the culture. And so when you call your best friend a retard, even though you're a good person, even though you believe in respect for people of all abilities and disabilities, you are contributing to a culture that makes it easier for other people like Dylan to use that word indiscriminately to describe people with actual disabilities. You may be uncomfortable with this responsibility, but you are contributing to a culture that encourages people to disrespect others who are different from themselves. Some of you just cannot handle that responsibility. No, freedom of speech, whatever. Okay. But this is how bias works. It's all connected. And Dan Niblock understands that the political commentator who uses the word retarded makes it tough for his son to make it through a day at school without someone making fun of him based on the fact that he has Down syndrome. And I would take it further than that. When we contribute to a culture that encourages people to disrespect people based on the fact that they are different from ourselves, we then make it easier for individuals to go out and commit hate crimes. It's all connected because bias is both individual and cultural, and they all learned it somewhere. It's learned behavior, just like with those young Sneetches. We try so hard not to see ourselves in the star-bellied Sneetches, but there's a bit of us in every single one of them. And there's a bit of them in every single one of us. So, addressing bias at Sanford High School, we get to the end. What now? I'd like to think that you're sitting there and thinking to yourself, we can do better than this. We can do better than this in this state, and we can do better than this in this school. And where you draw that line on what better is, it might be different for every single one of you, but surely we can do better than this. And I think most of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, want to do better than this. We just don't know how to get there. Because there's that culture thing again. And that culture thing, it's pretty persuasive. Well, here's what I would like from all of you. One, take this seriously. So far, so good. For 40 minutes, it appears that you've been taking this seriously. I hope that you'll keep thinking about this. I especially hope that you'll think about this when you're alone. Now, when you and your friends leave here, it might be harder to take it seriously then, but deep down, I think most of us, when we're alone, we can take this seriously and have some real thoughts about this. Keep taking it seriously, beyond just our time together here. And then, look at yourself. It's so easy to point the finger at everyone else and their bias and their prejudice. Look at your own behavior. That's tough work. That can be uncomfortable. Some of us just may not be there yet. Can't handle that yet. Well, I encourage every single one of you to look at your own behavior. It doesn't mean you're a bad person if you contribute to a culture of bias. It means you're a person who has some work to do, like every single one of us. Now, 1 and 2, take this seriously, look at yourself. I've got a number 3, but before we get to number 3, if you're looking at 1 and 2 and you're just rolling your eyes and really looking forward to the end of our time together, I'm sorry. If you can't take this seriously, if you refuse to look at yourself, I do have this special little interruption for you. It is a copy of the Sanford Schools Policy ACAA, Harassment and Sexual Harassment of Students. I don't want to make a big deal about this, but there are policy reasons for you to take this seriously and look at your own behavior. So here we go. Harassment of students because of race, color, sex, sexual orientation, religion, ancestry, or national origin, or disability is prohibited. Such conduct is a violation of Sanford School Committee policy and may constitute illegal discrimination under state and federal laws. One of the state laws I already shared with you is the Maine Civil Rights Act, our anti-hate crimes law. But I also just want to show you that right here in school policy is basically grounded everything that we're talking about here today. We got race, color, sex, sexual orientation, religion, ancestry, national origin, disability, right there. All right, down here, harassment. Harassment includes, but is not limited to, verbal abuse based on race, color, sex, sexual orientation, religion, ancestry, or national origin, or disability. Words alone can constitute harassment. So if you think, whatever, I don't care what you have to say, I'm going to just keep saying what I want, well, there is a school policy here that says you should think twice about that. I am so sorry to basically interrupt our conclusion for that, because most of you want to do right because you want to do right. It's not about the policy. So let's go back. 1, take this seriously. 2, look at yourself. 3, change the culture. Like, if you're willing to work on yourself, then maybe you can take it further and try to change this culture. The culture of Sanford High School. And we have an exciting opportunity for you on that front, because I'm part of the Civil Rights Team project, and your school is part of the Civil Rights Team project, because this year, new to your school, is the Sanford High School Civil Rights Team. And the Civil Rights Team is an extracurricular group who will specifically engage this school community in thinking and talking about issues related to race and skin color, national origin and ancestry, religion, disabilities, gender, including gender identity and expression, and sexual orientation, for the simple reason that we believe that all students should feel safe, welcome, and respected for who they are. I think most of us agree with that. So I would encourage you to support the work of the Civil Rights Team, which you're going to find out a little bit more about in a second, and maybe even think of joining the Civil Rights Team. I'm Brandon Baldwin. I'm here representing the Civil Rights Team project. I want to thank you for being a wonderful audience. I want to bring up one of these Civil Rights Team advisors, Rebecca Laborsmith, and I want you to applaud her and yourselves for being a wonderful audience today.
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin, so much for your time, your expertise, your knowledge, and for sharing that with us here. I'm Rebecca Laborsmith. I'm a school psychologist, but more importantly, I'm one of the advisors of your civil rights team. The other advisors are Ms. Whitney, Mr. Verzosa, and Mr. Titone. And if we have any of our civil rights team members in the audience, would you guys just stand up for a minute so students can see you? They know who you are. Next time I ask that question, there's going to be a lot more of you standing up. So now that we're more aware of bias in exactly all its forms and what it looks like, the question is, what do we do about it? And that's where your civil rights team has some help for you. Tomorrow, in your Spartan Time homerooms, we have prepared pocket guides for every single one of you. Because when we see this stuff happening in our halls, on the buses, in the cafeteria, we don't like it, but we often don't know exactly what to do. And these pocket guides give you 4 really simple things that you can do. Because the culture is going to change with all of your help. The more allies there are, the easier this stuff gets. If you would like to join the civil rights team, we meet every Monday after school in Ms. Whitney's classroom, B235. We would welcome you. And if you can't, for whatever reason, make our next meeting and you want to join, you could see any one of the advisors I mentioned, you could email any of us, or you can talk to your peers and we will get our information to you. Okay, that is it.